Hey guys, welcome to an interesting video on Wild Rift. So today we're back with an updated guide for summoner spells on ADCs. So previously in the last patch 6.0, I believe when they introduced cleanse into the game, I did of course go over all of the spells and kind of when's good to take what and what you guys should take and when you should take it, etc, etc. But since then, I've kind of learned a lot myself about which spells are good and in what situations, and I have more to add. And also, they did make some changes. Like for example, cleanse cooldown went up, as well as the uh, immunity to disables has gone down from, like, I think it was 0.5 seconds to 0.25 seconds or something like that. So I'm gonna go through all of them, one by one. So what spells are we gonna be talking about? Of course, we're gonna talk specifically about ADCs. So we're not gonna talk about things like smite. We're not going to talk about spells that don't exist in solo queue like Snowball and Clarity. So let's first start off with Heal and Ignite. So in my opinion, these are the most outlier in terms of the fact that normally you're not going to take Heal or Ignite. Normally you are going to take Barrier, Exhaust, Ghost, or Cleanse. So generally you're choosing between the four. Heal and Ignite are options as well. So Ignite is a very, very rare aggressive option that you want to go for. So the only two ADCs I've ever seen take Ignite is normally Lucian or Draven, and this is because they kind of want to look for kills in lane, and it's a little bit of a cheesy way to try to find kills in lane. I personally never recommend taking Ignite as an ADC, but if you want to, those are probably the two champions that people take it more on. Obviously, Ignite, what it does is it gives damage over time for a couple of seconds that deals true damage, and of course tries to help you get kills, as well as applying grievous wounds, which is kind of helpful against people who have healing, but once again is not really taken on ADCs. Next we have Heal. So Heal, and again, it heals yourself and the nearest person to you by the same amount and gives movement speed. So it's a pretty good spell. But the main reason why ADCs don't really take the spell is this is more of a supportive spell, right? Because it heals both yourself and someone else. So Heal on support, especially Enchantress, can help prop things like Iron Sensor, Staff of Flowing Water, and things that prop off of heals and shields. So normally it's taken by a support and not the ADC. And second reason why ADCs don't normally take this is because there's Barrier, right? So the Barrier shield at base summon, you can see is already larger than the heal shield, and you can see at the max level it's 560 for Barrier and it's 400 for shield. So Barrier for ADCs is just a better version of heal. So normally ADCs don't take normally they don't take heal or ignite. So normally it's between, again, these four options. So let's kind of start with Ghost. So Ghost is basically a summoner spell that it's not very lane oriented, but it's more mid to late game oriented. Now why do I say that? Because for Ghost, basically the only real use of it in lane is normally you pop it to either run away from a gang that's incoming, or if your enemy is running you down, you can pop the Ghost to run away, or you can pop it to run someone down. That does sound like it's pretty useful, and it is, but the main usage of Ghost is really in mid to late game team fights, like those dragon fights, baron fights, where you're basically 5v5 or 4v4 situations like that, where having the extra movement speed is very important to keeping your distance as an ADC, to keep yourself in the backline of the fight and prevent enemies from reaching you, and then getting resets on your Ghost helps out a lot in that in team fights as well. The second main reason why Ghost is not really a lane spell is because imagine you have Ghost versus someone who has like Exhaust or Barrier, right? So if you're in and all in, the guy pops his Barrier, he gets a shield, right? He blocks 2 to 3 of your auto attacks, whereas you have Ghost, and all you can do is kind of run around. It's mobility, right? It's not very useful in combat. So Ghost is really targeted at the mid to late game. So whenever you want to take Ghost, two things must happen, right? Number one, the lane that you're in must not be a lane that you're hard losing, right? Or, I mean, it could be a lane that you're hard losing, right? Because you're just playing for mid to late game instead of playing for a lane, right? But basically, if the enemy takes a combat summoner and you take Ghost, you have to kind of note that you're already at an inherent all-in disadvantage in lane. So, secondly, only really certain champions want to take Ghost. So these are champions that generally have low mobility and or has really good use for movement speed. So example of these champions are champions like Jinx, Zeri, maybe Xayah, Varus, champions like that. Certain champions don't really want to take Ghosts. For example, if you have like a Tristana or a Kai'Sa that are champions that can get kills in lane and that are aggressive in lane, or like Draven, Lucian, these champions never want to take goals. So only certain champions want to take goals in the first place for the mid and late game team fights. Other champions never want goals anyway. And of course, you have to take note, taking goals makes you a lot weaker in lane. So the next spell we're going to talk about is Cleanse. So Cleanse, again, it got the cooldown increases in 110 seconds compared to 100 seconds on Barrier and 100 seconds on Exhaust and 90 seconds on Ghost. It's the longest cooldown spell, Cleanse. But Cleanse, of course, is incredibly OP in certain games, right? In a lot of games, actually. So what does it do? It removes all spell debuffs and gives you immunity to disables for 0.25 seconds. So what does this work on, right? This works on basically any CC, except suppression. So for example, knockups, you can cleanse that, roots, you can cleanse that, stuns, you can cleanse that, but suppression, for example, Warwick's ultimate, you cannot cleanse suppressions. So that's the one weakness of cleanse. You can also cleanse ignite, and you can also cleanse exhaust. So basically, the main time you want to pick cleanse is when there is a lot of enemy CC, either in lane or in the entire team. So the best time to take this is if someone relies on their CC spell to get off all the damage. So for example, it's normally on mages, right? So for example, Morgana Q, very important CC spell. For example, Ahri Charm or Lux Root, like Ahri starts off her combo with the Charm a lot of the times, and then she hits the rest of her spells like Q on you. Same with Lux, she always hits you with the Root first, and then he goes into E and then R because you're rooted on the spot and you cannot dodge. So against these kind of combo-centric champions that start off with a CC, Cleanse is insanely OP, and basically, Cleanse should always be your first option. Like when I'm personally kind of taking a look at the game and deciding my summon spell, my first question is always going to be, do I need cleanse this game? So if I need cleanse, I'm going to take it. If I don't need cleanse, then I'm going to start looking at Ghost, Barrier, and Exhaust, right? So next up, of course, we're going to talk about Exhaust, right? So Exhaust, basically what it does, you target someone that's close to you, you apply the Exhaust onto them, which slows them by 35% and reduces the damage they deal by 40%. So as we know, we had an Exhaust meta not too long ago. Exhaust is a very, very strong spell in lane and in the later stages of the game as well. So of course, Exhaust is really helpful on champions who do a lot of DPS, particularly the enemy ADC, because obviously when you exhaust the enemy ADC, they're not only going to be slow, but they're also going to do 40% less damage. And 40% less damage is a lot, right? So that's pretty much going to allow you to win the 2v2 in a lot of all-ins if you have Exhaust. It's also very useful against assassins, right? So for example, assassins jump in, and you can just exhaust them, and their full combo is gonna do a lot less. So of course, one of the common things like when you're fighting Kha'Zix or Rengars is when you're walking around in the jungle, you want to be spamming your exhaust button, because if a Kha'Zix or Rengar leaps at you from out of nowhere, they're gonna get exhausted in mid-air, and they probably will not one-shot you because they are exhausted and they deal less damage. So the main kind of issue with taking Exhaust as an ADC right now is because Cleanse is a very popular spell, and you can cleanse Exhaust. So a lot of times if you take Exhaust and the enemy takes Cleanse, in lane, your Exhaust is going to be useless because the moment you exhaust, they're going to cleanse it. So that is kind of a bit of an issue, right? So there's two ways to circumvent this. Number one is you wait for them to cleanse some CC and then you exhaust them, which is very troublesome to do, and I don't really like doing that. Or number two brings us to our last summon spells. Instead of taking Exhaust, you take Barrier. So Barrier is probably the least popular spell out of the four of these. Like Cleanse, Exhaust, and Ghost are really, really popular, whereas Barrier is not really. But as you've seen from a lot of my videos, I've been playing a lot of Barrier and a lot of ADCs. And the main time you take Barrier is basically you look at Cleanse, I don't need Cleanse, right? And I don't need Ghost. So then if you don't need Cleanse and Ghost, it goes to Barrier and Exhaust. So the main thing I'm thinking about is generally Exhaust is better than Barrier. However, if I see that the enemy ADC is probably going to take Cleanse, then I'm going to take Barrier instead of Exhaust. So when is the enemy ADC likely to take Cleanse? Well, put yourself in their shoes, and if you're going to take Cleanse in their shoes, they're probably going to do it too. Like for example, if they're against a Leona support, I'm definitely taking Cleanse, no questions asked, right? Or if I'm against a team that has like a Lux support Ahri mid lane, I'm definitely taking Cleanse. Of course, some of the situations are a little bit grey, and it's a little bit of personal preference sometimes, but in general, if you think you're going to take Cleanse, they're probably going to do it also, so you should not be taking exhaust because in lane your exhaust can just be cleansed away. So barrier, in my opinion, is the slightly, and I mean slightly, worser version of exhaust. Now, why do I say it's slightly worser? Well, the cooldown is the same, right? But exhaust, basically completely disables a single enemy, whereas barrier kind of blocks all incoming damage, right? So in the grand scheme of things, I think disabling one enemy for a lot of damage is better than having a shield that just blocks a little bit of damage. But I do think that barrier is very, very strong in lane, right? Because if you barrier at like level 1, level 2, it blocks the damage of roughly 3 auto attacks from the enemy ADC, 2 to 3 auto attacks from the enemy ADC, and that can turn the level 1 fight. So for example, if you have barrier and they have cleanse, and then you get into a level 1 fight, you barrier, they have nothing really to cleanse, so you're gonna win that fight because you have barrier. And in lane it's really strong. In the mid to late game it's still really decent. Like you can block a decent amount of damage with barrier because the shield does scale into the mid and late game as well. So really a lot of the times, if you don't count into ghost, it's a game of rock paper scissors again with like exhaust, barrier, and cleanse, right? Because cleanse counters exhaust counters barrier, and barrier counters cleanse. If you kind of see what I'm saying there. And what I mean by that is when you have cleanse versus exhaust, cleanse wins because they can cleanse exhaust. When you have exhaust versus barrier, exhaust generally wins because you can reduce their damage for a longer duration, whereas barrier just block a little bit of damage. And then you have barrier versus cleanse, barrier wins because barrier gives you a shield, whereas cleanse only removes CC. And if you're not CCing them, cleanse doesn't really do anything. So it's a lot of times a rock paper scissors between these three, and then of course ghost is just kind of there as a little bit of a wild card where you're making use of movement speed in the mid to late game on those specific champions that I mentioned just now, right? So I think that this updated guide is going to be a lot better than the previous one because I have a lot of added detail here, and of course I'll be referring to this guide on a lot of my videos to kind of redirect you guys here to kind of get my opinions on the summoner spells. But anyways, with all that out the way, thank you guys so much for watching the video, and goodbye.